Hi, my name is Uni Vang, and this is
Linda Moore.
Peng Yang.
and we're going to be talking about public relations and information and cybersecurity today for ICS 484-01 cyber operations. Okay, so I'm going to open it up with the basics of public relations and what questions companies are asked when it comes to data breaches. We're going to also discuss about bad examples and good examples, and then close it up with a conclusion. So what are some of the things we look at when evaluating incident response? We look at public acknowledgement. Was the response timely, and was the response given with quality? Were damages accounted for that were caused to customers, and what were they promised to remediate these damages? Are companies being upfront with what happened and the risks, or are they sugar-coated? Was the response based on proactive or reactive countermeasures? And what was the aftermath? What happened after the breach? Did they take the right countermeasures to secure their systems and configurations, and were customers given what they were promised?
So I want to talk about what I believe Equifax did wrong from a PR perspective. The time between when they discovered the breach and when they announced the breach was 6 weeks total. Now I understand that companies, when they incur these breaches, they have to they need time to make sure that they've gotten all the hackers out of their network and can clean up any mess that may have been left behind. But I felt 6 weeks was way too long of a time frame for them to wait to announce. In addition, within this 6 weeks time frame, some $2 million in stock that in Equifax stock was sold off by some executives within the company. Now Equifax claims that these executives who sold these stocks had no idea of the breach, but it's still a big black eye because it can be seen as insider knowledge, and they gaining advantage of their insider knowledge. After they had publicly announced the breach, there were some blunders made by Equifax too. One of them that I wanted to point out was the multiple communication sources. They had their public relations person making communications, and then they also had social media communications. And what happened was they actually redirected some of the consumers to a malicious website, or a website that was bogus. Not necessarily malicious, but it was a bogus website that even put a bigger black eye on Equifax. Equifax also, during their after they had publicly announced this breach, they did offer up some services for consumers impacted by this. But another thing I wanted to point out was when they offered the free credit monitoring service. Reading the fine print, there was an arbitration clause in there where it kind of sounded like if you accepted this, then you gave up your right to sue Equifax, and that also is another big black eye for Equifax. Another interesting fact that I wanted to point out was whenever a company incurs something negative like this, you kind of want to not stick your name you want to limit your exposure to this type of event as much as possible. What I found was in 3 public release documents that Equifax made after the breach, there was a study done by IACIS.org, and they used a text mining software to sift through these 3 report releases, and they found within there that the word Equifax was mentioned a total of 73 times. Definitely not something that you want to keep reiterating with associating your name with a bad event. So what did this cost Equifax altogether? Well, one day after the breach, Equifax stock went down 13.7%. Up to May of 2019, Equifax has reported that this breach has cost them a total of $1.3 billion. And as of July 2019, they have settled a lawsuit for $700 million where consumers can go out, and if they were impacted by this breach, you can claim your share of their settlement, which I believe is $125.
Alright, right, so we've heard the bad. Now let's hear guidelines on how to make the good and how a company can maintain a reputable image after a breach. One of the first guidelines is take the stance of standing by your customers / clients / constituents. This is something that Apple had done for an issue that had come up a few years ago. We'll go through their particular situation in the next few slides. The second guideline, communicate openly and consistently in all outlets used, and seek PR counsel if needed. This includes controlling the flow of communication, i.e. Equifax. Peng had talked earlier about how the lines of communication can get messy and how inadvertent mistakes can be handled, along with support staff may be sharing information that is inaccurate and further damaging their reputation. The third guideline, actively creating a proactive, not reactive, plan to prevent or mitigate this in the future and include necessary stakeholders. This one speaks to itself. In a lot of cases, companies will create a risk assessment plan even before there's a breach just to have all their ducks in a row. Number 4, let your reputation, ratings, and hard data speak for you. This was the case with Uber a few years ago when some of the drivers working for the company thought that they weren't getting a good wage at the time. They ended up banding together, putting an article out on Medium saying that they didn't think it was fair and would like a higher wage. Uber in return actually did not directly answer back to those individuals. Instead, they shared out a chart that showed that the wages were actually increasing over time from the years 2013 to 2015, started to contradict an article that was slandering them in a way. Number 5, focus on the human connection. So this is the case of Snapchat, where a few years ago their CEO had confidential information leaked out. This was between another high-level executive, and they talked about sort of financial dealings that were happening, strategic planning. In this case, he showed what we would consider a vulnerable side of him, putting out in his own personal social media that he felt terrible that this happened, he wasn't sure what to do. Because the public saw that side of him, they ended up being more empathetic to the situation that was happening at hand. So one thing to remember is that the biggest difference between a crisis and a disaster is preparation and communication. Remember that you can't always prevent things from going wrong, but you can think about your communication and work to turn that crisis into better circumstances. That said, it is always better to be prepared than to begin remediation after the fact. So as I mentioned earlier, we would go into a deeper dive of what happened with Apple. So I call this Apple versus the US government. So following the 2015 San Bernardino mass shooting, the US government demanded that Apple implement special software on phones that would safely bypass security measures. This made national headlines. It was also known worldwide. Essentially, the government was asking Apple to do this so that if they wanted to get information on people's personal Apple devices, they could bypass any security settings and not damage the content that was inside of the phone. So what was Apple's response? Well, largely, they refused the government's demand with a very public letter. This letter is still available on their website today, and the link is right there. And litigation followed soon after between the two parties. One of the strongest and most impactful statements that came out of that letter, which just also happens to be the last paragraph, says, while we believe the FBI's intentions were good, it would be wrong for the government to force us to build a backdoor into our products. And ultimately, we fear that this demand would undermine the very freedoms and liberty our government is meant to protect. So what did this do? It sparked more public interest about cybersecurity, and it showed that Apple was, that they kept integrity with their customers, and that was highest above all else. So Apple's letter shed more light on the future of cybersecurity and public consumption. Not only this, following this incident and how Apple responded to it, a number of tech giants, including Google, Microsoft and Facebook stood by Apple, and together they formed what we know is the Reform Government Surveillance Coalition. So what happened in the end? Apple stood by their decision and refused to fulfill the government's request. In addition, the iPhone was ultimately hacked after the FBI spent $1.3 million on a secret tool. Apple made it clear from the start that they opposed the government's demand, not for their sake, but for their customers, and that was key. So wrapping this back up to the guidelines, recall the first one, which I'll reiterate here. Take the stance of standing by your customers / clients / constituents.
So in conclusion, public relations can save you a lot of money and prevent further loss depending on how you respond. It is essentially limiting the impact of your reputation and how your organization will stand after an attack or breach. Keep in mind that the wrong response and actions can badly injure your image and integrity, even go as far as aiding attackers.